I have worked with over 100 individuals and thought leaders to get them booked as guests on podcasts. And throughout that process, something became exceedingly clear. Here's what happens. Somebody is a guest on a podcast. The episode goes live. The guest grabs the link to the podcast, maybe creates a nice little copy around it, and then shares the link on social with their audience and their following. You're listening to this and you're thinking, okay, yeah, what's wrong with that? Well, there's nothing wrong with that per se, but there's so much more that we could be doing. And that is what I'm really excited to talk to you about today. Hi, I'm Cristina, and I'm here to talk to you about how you can leverage podcast guest booking as a means of audience development. Now, when I talk about audience development, what do I mean? When I speak about audience development, I really mean community building. Now, how can you use podcasts to build a community? Fantastic question. The very first piece that we need for all of this is guest booking. So again, guest booking is the beginning of the audience development piece that we're going to talk about. The second piece is content. So we'll be talking about guest booking, content, and then distribution. So let's just start with the meat and potatoes. Let's get into how to be a guest on a podcast, everything that takes. So the first thing that you're going to think about when you are going to be a guest on a podcast is, let's define your point of view. Why do you want to be on a podcast? What do you want to talk about? Somebody once told me a very long time ago, you know that thing that you always talk about? It always comes up. It just, for some reason, year after year, you think about it time and time again. And you just somehow will get there in a conversation. They told me that's what you should write a book about. And I love that. I think that's great advice. If there's a central theme that you keep coming back to in your life, maybe that is something that you should look a little bit closer at. And maybe that is something that you should write a book about. Alternatively, maybe it's something that you should talk about on a podcast. So that's just one way to consider, again, what you want to talk about on a podcast, what your point of view is. Another thing to consider is there a consumer problem that you just run into time and time again? Is there a challenge you face at work that, again, it time and time again, and you found a solution to it, or you have a proposition, a new idea, or maybe you've overcome a personal obstacle? There are a myriad of reasons, infinite, truly, why you might want to be on a podcast. So it's really important that you narrow down what that is. Once you have that narrowed down, we know what you're going to be talking about. That's fantastic. Now we have to identify what podcasts you're going to be on to speak about that point of view. Let's look at 4 things when we discuss determining whether or not a podcast is a best fit podcast or not. The 4 things that we're going to be looking at are content, context, audience, and reach. The content is what you're talking about. So what is the podcast talking about? And is that the same topic that you want to be talking about? Topics, themes, etc. These are the content pieces that we're talking about. What are they talking about? That is what we mean when we talk about content. What are we talking about? For context, it's how are they talking about it? So maybe you have the exact same, you're talking about the same things, but you could have polar opposite points of view on those topics. And that could be a good thing. Maybe that's something that you're looking for. Maybe you're looking for a healthy debate or, disrupt a little bit, have a disruptive conversation over a specific topic or a theme. And that's fine. But again, you need to make sure that you have that narrowed down so that when you look at these pieces, you can identify whether or not this podcast is a good fit for you or not. Because if a podcast typically is not looking for a debate or a challenge, then again, probably not going to be a best fit podcast if that is something that you're looking to do. So again, content, what are we talking about? Context, how is it being discussed? Audience, what people are they attracting to this show? Who lives in the audience? There are some qualitative measures that we can look at to gauge, again, who is in this audience. We could look at the comments, first and foremost, the reviews of this podcast, to get some information and feedback of who these people are, who the listeners are of this podcast. Another thing that we could look at, again, qualitative information here, is we could go ahead and look at the episodes and try to understand who they are directed to. Listen to the podcast, listen to multiple episodes of the podcast. Who does it feel like this podcast is for? And does that align with who you want to be talking to? Audience, content, context, audience, and now reach. Now, unless you're working with a company that has, episode reach estimates, it's going to be a little bit difficult to gauge whether or not, how big a podcast is. But there are some, again, measures that we can look to define that. One of those being how they perform on social media. Does the podcast host have a social media platform? Does the podcast itself have a social media platform? And how do they perform there? Also, how many people have left reviews? If there are a lot of reviews, probably a pretty popular podcast, versus if there aren't too many reviews. But I also don't want us to get caught up here in terms of reach, because again, content and context and audience truly really are so much more important. I like to think about this often, and an example that I give sometimes is I could put you in front of 5,000 people who are I just pulled them off the street, 5,000 people. Or I could put you in front of 20 CEOs. Now, if your mission is to talk to leaders of the industry, then maybe the 20 CEOs would be a more powerful group to be in front of than the 5,000 random people that I pulled off the street. So again, reach, it's important to some degree, but I would keep that example in mind, that really if we're hitting the right audience and the content and the context is there, the reach it's maybe less important. So we have defined your point of view, and we have identified a best fit show. Next, we're going to want to do pitching. Now, we're going to reach out to this podcast and we're going to tell them why you should be on it. Now, you just did a bunch of research. Podcasters receive multiple emails a day of people who want to be a guest on their podcast. So it's really important that you lead with value. I say that intentionally. You want to look at a podcast, again, do the research on it and see where you fit in. And then that is what you want to lead with in your interview. You can add in your bio as it goes along, but you really want to synthesize why your point of view and the show's point of view both benefit the audience. So the podcaster is really in charge of making sure that they give their audience the content that they're looking for. So you having a unique perspective, an experience that you want to share, lead with how that benefits the audience in your pitch. You also are going to want to keep it short. I receive a lot of these emails myself as well, and if they go on and on and on, really you just want to keep it short, concise as possible. So that is a little bit about pitching. Formatting, again, is something that I would be mindful of. You want to be intentional with things that you underline or bold or links that you use, because any change in font essentially is a call to action. So when you bold something, you are calling action or calling attention to that bold piece. So again, just be really intentional in your formatting. Keep it short, keep it concise, and make sure that you lead again with value. Now we've sent off the pitch and the host of the show reaches back and they want to go and do this interview with you. So that's great. We get you scheduled and you do the interview and you have a fantastic discussion with this person. The next piece is, again, the episode is going to go live. We will briefly take a second to talk about zero-click theory. Again, I am briefly going to discuss it, but it is something that I would recommend after this lesson or after this video, you look into a little bit deeper on your own. So zero-click theory at its core means that social media websites do not want you to leave their website. If you notice, there are very few places where you can actually link out of a social media site. For example, when you are on Instagram, it will typically say link in bio or anything, because the only place where the social media websites want you to leave that link is somewhere like a bio, because they want you to stay on site. So just sharing the link is not only not that effective because the algorithm's kind of going to crush it, but also there's so much more that we can be doing with that link. So again, if our intention is audience development, let's look at it this way. We get you booked on a podcast, or you get yourself booked on a podcast. Fantastic. Now you are engaging with a new audience, and you are going to be attracting people to your brand. And that could be a personal brand, but to your brand. Next, we want to keep engaging with them, but we also want to expand our reach, because podcast episodes are just content treasure troves. From one 30-minute interview, you could create multiple different pieces of video content. If there's no video associated with the podcast, you could create animation. If you still want to use audiograms, you could use audiograms. You could also create graphics, still graphics for, again, social posting. You can create blog posts. There is almost endless content that can be repurposed from a podcast episode. So that is our next piece here, which is content. So we take that podcast episode, and instead of sharing the link, and you can share the link maybe in a comment or something like that. I'm not discouraging sharing the link, but there are more effective ways that we can talk about this podcast, and we can engage people who go beyond that podcast audience, but also share those same thoughts and ideas. So again, we're continuing to develop our audience. We are building upon each block. Now, having tapped into somebody else's audience already, having this content, how can we then further develop our audience? That next piece is going to be distribution. So through distribution, through distributing the content that we already have, we've engaged with one individual's audience already. Now we can take this content and put it in front of our audience. Maybe that's on social media, but we can also put it in front of more audiences. So I encourage you, yes, to share these pieces on social media, but the assets should go much further than that. And one podcast industry secret, if you will, is that a lot of community building, community engagement is really happening in industry-specific newsletters. So if you can go ahead and pitch your podcast appearance, some of those assets, if you will, as well, to these podcast newsletters or just industry-specific newsletters, you're going to, again, expand that reach and further build your community. And you're going to identify where they live in this process. Are they on those industry-specific newsletters? That's a really great insight to have. Is there a specific blog? Where do they get advice from? Do they get advice from these newsletters? Do they get advice from a particular blog? Is there a particular journal that they look to? Also, where do they hang out? Are they on Discord? Are they on Slack? Are there private Facebook communities that we should be putting this material in front of? So really going beyond just the social media aspect of where we could distribute this content and going even further into these niche communities to then again further build your audience. Let's take one final look at everything that we've discussed today. So in order to use podcasting as a means of building and developing an audience, first of all, you need to get booked on a podcast. In order to get booked on a podcast, you need to define your point of view. After defining your point of view, remember to look for best fit podcasts. And in order to do that, we can look to content, context, audience, and reach. After defining the best fit podcasts, you're going to go ahead and pitch the host or the production team of that podcast. And the main thing to keep in mind with that is, remember, lead with value. Don't just spray and pray. Make a personal connection with every person that you email. Next up, you're going to get on that podcast and you're going to crush that interview. After you crush that interview, it goes live. Remember, Zero click theory. We don't just want to share the link. So, what are we going to do? We're going to take that content and repurpose it into a myriad of other content. That could be maybe 10, 15, 20 more pieces of material that you can then share with your audience. Again, furthering this community development through engaging with them in these content pieces. Next up is, again, the distribution. So we have all of this content and we've put it on social, but we can go a little bit further. So make sure that you keep in mind that industry-specific tip is those newsletters are gems. And that is where a lot of action is happening, a lot of community development occurs. So make sure you tap into those newsletters and identify other places outside of social media for you to share that content. Those pieces all combined, again, with guest booking as the flywheel that spins it all up, make for an audience development plan that you can use on your own or with your team to further expand your core audience and engage with them on a deeper level.